Your decision to revoke the avoidant person's access to you, blocking them on social media, not responding to their messages, refusing to maintain casual contact, creating firm boundaries that prevent them from drifting in and out of your life at their convenience, was one of the most powerful moves you could have made, both for your own healing and for disrupting the dynamic that allowed their patterns to continue unchallenged. This move was powerful because it completely shifted the balance of power in a relationship dynamic where they held all the control, where they decided when contact happened and how much intimacy existed, where they could withdraw whenever they wanted and return whenever they felt like it, always knowing you'd be available. By revoking their access, you took that control away from them and placed it firmly in your own hands. You're no longer available for their convenience. You're no longer an option they can explore when their loneliness outweighs their fear or when their other connections aren't satisfying them. You're no longer participating in the push-pull dynamic where they push you away and then pull you back, where they create distance and then breach it on their terms, where they hurt you through their inconsistency and then soothe you just enough to keep you engaged. Revoking access was powerful because it forced real consequences for their patterns in ways they've probably never experienced before, in ways that can't be negotiated or manipulated around, in ways that communicate unambiguously that their behavior has cost them something permanent. It was powerful because it protected you from continued exposure to their destabilizing patterns, from the emotional whiplash of their hot and cold behavior, from the constant uncertainty and anxiety that characterize trying to maintain connection with someone who was fundamentally unavailable. It was powerful because it created the space and the distance you needed to heal, to remember who you are outside of the relationship's chaos, to rebuild your sense of self-worth that their patterns had eroded, to move forward with your life rather than remaining stuck in limbo, waiting for them to decide they wanted you. And it was powerful because it sent clear message, not just to them, but to yourself, that you value yourself enough to walk away from situations that don't serve you, that you won't tolerate being treated as optional or as backup plan, that you require reciprocity and consistency and genuine partnership rather than accepting whatever breadcrumbs someone is willing to offer. The power in revoking access is not about punishing them or playing games. It's about taking back your agency, protecting your well-being, and refusing to participate in dynamics that diminish you. How removing access shifted the entire power dynamic. The relationship dynamic between you and the avoidant person was fundamentally imbalanced in terms of power and control, with them holding most of it through their ability to withdraw, to create and maintain distance, to decide when and how much connection happened, and to keep you in state of uncertainty about where you stood and what the future held. Your decision to revoke their access completely shifted this dynamic by removing their ability to control the terms of engagement and by placing you in position of power you didn't have while you were available to them. Understanding how this power shift occurred and what it means reveals why this was such a strategically powerful move. The primary way revoking access shifted the power dynamic is that it removed their ability to control the distance and the contact between you. Throughout the relationship and even after it ended, the avoidant person maintained control over when you were in contact and when you weren't. They could reach out when they wanted connection or validation or company, knowing you would likely respond because you cared about them and because you hoped their reach out meant they were ready to work on things. They could disappear when they wanted space or when intimacy felt too threatening, knowing you would be there when they returned. This ability to control the contact gave them enormous power because it meant they never had to truly face loss or consequence. They could have the benefits of your presence when they wanted them and the relief of distance when they needed it. But revoking access destroyed this control. You removed their ability to reach you when convenient for them. You took away their power to decide when contact happened. The control over connection shifted entirely to you. You decide if contact happens. You decide under what terms. You decide whether to respond to any attempts they make to reach you. This reversal of control is profoundly disorienting and disempowering for someone who is accustomed to maintaining the upper hand. Revoking access shifted the power dynamic by making you unavailable in ways that trigger their loss aversion and their fear without giving them any way to manage or mitigate that discomfort. The avoidant person is driven by dual anxieties: intimacy anxiety that makes closeness uncomfortable, and loss anxiety that makes abandonment threatening. Throughout the relationship, they manage these competing anxieties by controlling distance, pulling away when intimacy anxiety was high, and knowing you'd still be available when loss anxiety kicked in. But your complete unavailability activates their loss anxiety without giving them their typical solution of reaching out to test if you're still there or to get just enough connection to ease the discomfort. They're experiencing the fear of permanent loss without any control over whether that loss is real or reversible. This lack of control over their own emotional experience is terrifying for someone whose entire defensive structure is built around maintaining control, and it creates power imbalance where you hold something they want access to you, and they have no way to obtain it except on your terms. Revoking access shifted the power dynamic by making you the person who is moving forward while they're the one who is stuck thinking about what they lost. During the relationship and immediately after, they likely felt superior in their ability to move on, to not be as affected by the distance, to maintain their defended independence while you were visibly struggling with the inconsistency and the loss. But your decision to revoke access and to genuinely move forward with your life reverse this dynamic. You're the one who is healing, growing, building life without them. They're the one who is stuck comparing others to you, monitoring your life from whatever distance they can manage, unable to fully move on because you're no longer playing your assigned role of being available and waiting. This reversal, where you're the strong one moving forward and they're the affected one, unable to let go, is complete inversion of the power dynamic they were comfortable with. Revoking access shifted the power dynamic by removing the validation and ego boost they received from your continued availability and interest. Even when the avoidant person was distant or had ended the relationship, knowing you were still there, still cared, still would respond if they reached out, provided subtle validation that they mattered to you, that they were important enough that you couldn't fully let them go. This validation served their ego and their sense of their own worth and desirability, even while they were rejecting what you were offering. But revoking access removed this source of validation. Your lack of availability communicates that they no longer have claim on your attention or your emotional energy. They're no longer important enough in your life to maintain access to you. This loss of validation is threatening to their ego and creates discomfort they cannot resolve through their usual strategies of reaching out or maintaining casual contact. Revoking access shifted the power dynamic by forcing them to sit with the consequences of their behavior without being able to mitigate those consequences through partial reconnection. The avoidant person's pattern often includes hurting people through their defensive behavior and then offering just enough connection or apology or renewed interest to prevent permanent loss while never actually changing the underlying patterns. This allows them to maintain relationships in some form while never having to fully face consequences of their behavior. But revoking access prevents this pattern. They cannot offer you breadcrumbs of connection to ease your hurt or their guilt. They cannot test the waters to see if you're still available. They cannot maintain the ambiguous middle ground where they're not fully with you, but you're not fully unavailable to them. The consequences of their behavior, losing you completely, are unavoidable and permanent. And this represents level of accountability they've probably never experienced before. Revoking access shifted the power dynamic by demonstrating that you have standards and boundaries that they cannot cross, that you value yourself enough to walk away from treatment that doesn't meet those standards. Throughout the relationship, your tolerance of their patterns might have communicated to them that you didn't have firm boundaries, that you would accept whatever they offered, that you valued the relationship more than you valued yourself. This perception gave them power because they knew they could treat you poorly, and you would stay. But revoking access shattered this perception. You demonstrated that you do have boundaries, that those boundaries are firm and non-negotiable, that you will walk away and stay away when treatment falls below your standards. This demonstration of self-worth and boundary enforcement is powerful because it means they can no longer take you for granted, can no longer assume you'll tolerate their patterns, can no longer operate with the arrogant confidence that you'll always be available, regardless of how they behave. The psychological impact of no longer being available. Your unavailability, created through revoking the avoidant person's access to you, is having specific psychological impacts on them that are different from and more intense than what they've typically experienced in relationship endings. Understanding these impacts illuminates why your move was so powerful and why it's creating the discomfort and the disruption in their defended equilibrium that it is. The first psychological impact is that your complete unavailability is activating their abandonment wounds and loss anxiety in ways that partial distance or soft endings never did. The avoidant person's defensive system developed to protect them from the pain of abandonment and rejection they experienced in childhood. But ironically, their defensive strategies of creating distance usually protect them from fully experiencing this pain in adult relationships because they control the distance and they maintain some level of access that prevents complete loss. Your decision to revoke access and become completely unavailable removes this protection. They're experiencing what genuine abandonment feels like. Someone they care about is gone, is not available to them, may never be available again. This activation of their core wound is intensely uncomfortable and is forcing them to feel the very pain their defenses were designed to prevent. The psychological impact is profound because they cannot use their usual defensive strategies to manage this pain, since those strategies depended on having some level of access or control. The second psychological impact is that your unavailability is forcing confrontation with their own culpability and responsibility for the loss in ways they've been able to avoid in previous relationships. When the avoidant person has been able to maintain some contact, or when their partners have pursued them or expressed continued interest, they could maintain ambiguity about who was responsible for the ending or what it meant. But your complete unavailability makes the causation clear. Their patterns drove you away. Their behavior cost them the relationship. Their choices created this outcome. There's no ambiguity to hide behind. No way to blame you or circumstances. No way to maintain the fiction that the relationship just didn't work out for vague reasons. The clarity of causation is psychologically uncomfortable because it forces them to sit with their responsibility and their agency in creating the loss they're now experiencing. The third psychological impact is that your unavailability is destroying their ability to maintain the fantasy that they could have you back if they wanted, that you were there as option they could explore when ready. This fantasy served important psychological function. It allowed them to experience their defended independence without having to fully face the cost of that independence, because they could tell themselves you were still available if they changed their mind. But your unavailability shatters this fantasy. You're not available. You're not waiting. You won't be there if they decide they want you back. This destruction of the comforting fantasy forces them to confront the reality that their choices have permanent consequences, that they've actually lost you rather than just postpone the relationship, and this reality is more difficult to bear than the fantasy was. The fourth psychological impact is that your unavailability is triggering their competitive instincts and their desire for what they cannot have. The avoidant person's psychology includes paradoxical pattern where they value what's scarce or inaccessible more than what's readily available. When you were available, pursuing them, tolerating their patterns, you triggered their intimacy anxiety and their tendency to devalue what they have. But now that you're completely unavailable, you've become scarce and inaccessible, which activates their desire and their pursuit instincts. They want what they cannot have. They're drawn to what's unavailable. This psychological response means they're experiencing increased desire for you, an increased sense of your value precisely because you removed their access, creating an ironic situation where your unavailability makes them want you more than your availability ever did. The fifth psychological impact is that your unavailability is preventing them from obtaining the closure or the final word or the maintenance of their preferred narrative about the relationship. The avoidant person often needs to control the narrative about relationship endings to protect their ego and their self-image. They need to maintain their story about why things didn't work, about what was wrong with the relationship or with you, about how they were justified in their choices. But your unavailability prevents them from having conversations that would allow them to shape or solidify this narrative. They cannot explain themselves to you. They cannot get your agreement with their version of events. They cannot have the final word that would allow them to feel settled in their narrative. This lack of closure and lack of control over the narrative is psychologically destabilizing and leaves them with unresolved tension they cannot easily manage. The sixth psychological impact is that your unavailability is making them question their own judgment and their own assessment of the relationship and of you. During the relationship, they operated with certain assumptions, that you were too needy, that the relationship wasn't right, that they were better off alone, that you would always be available. But your unavailability contradicts all of these assumptions. If you were truly too needy or too dependent, why are you so capable of being unavailable now? If the relationship truly wasn't right, why does losing it hurt this much? If they're truly better off alone, why does your absence create such discomfort? If you are always going to be available, why aren't you available now? These contradictions between their assumptions and the reality of your unavailability force them to question whether they assessed things correctly, whether their perception was accurate, whether they made catastrophic error in judgment. This questioning of their own assessment is psychologically threatening because it suggests they cannot trust their own perception and evaluation of situations. The seventh psychological impact is that your unavailability is creating space for their authentic feelings to surface without the distraction or confusion of ongoing contact. When the avoidant person had access to you, when there was possibility of contact or ongoing communication, their defensive system remained activated, managing their responses and suppressing their feelings to maintain their defended position. But your complete unavailability removes the need for this active defense. There's no one to defend against, no intimacy to manage, no vulnerability to prevent. In this space, their authentic feelings about you and about the loss are beginning to surface. They're recognizing they care more than they showed, that they miss you more than they expected, that the loss hurts more than they allowed themselves to feel initially. This emergence of authentic feeling is psychologically uncomfortable because it contradicts their defended narrative about not needing anyone and about being fine alone. What they lost when they could no longer reach you. When you revoked the avoidant person's access to you, they lost far more than just the ability to send you a message or to see your social media updates. They lost a constellation of benefits, both tangible and psychological, that your availability provided to them even when they were distant or when the relationship had ended. Understanding the specific losses created by your unavailability reveals why this move was so powerful and why it's creating such significant impact on them. The avoidant person lost their safety net, the reassurance that you were there as option they could return to if they changed their mind or if their other pursuits didn't satisfy them. This safety net allowed them to explore their defended independence, to maintain distance, to pursue other connections, all while knowing, at some level, that you were still there, still cared, still would likely accept them back if they decided they wanted to return. This knowledge provided psychological security that they didn't fully recognize until it was gone. Your unavailability removed this safety net, forcing them to face the reality that their choices have real and potentially permanent consequences, that walking away from you meant actually losing you rather than just creating temporary distance. The avoidant person lost access to the validation and ego boost that your continued interest and availability provided. Even when they were distant, even when they had ended the relationship, knowing you still cared about them, knowing you would respond if they reached out, knowing they mattered enough to you that you couldn't completely let go. All of this provided validation of their worth and their desirability. This validation was something they were receiving from you without having to give anything in return, without having to maintain the relationship, without having to meet your needs. It was cost-free validation that served their ego. But revoking access removed this source of validation. They no longer receive the subtle ego boost of knowing someone is thinking about them, caring about them, hoping for their return. This loss of validation creates gap in their psychological experience that they're struggling to fill elsewhere. The avoidant person lost the specific understanding and acceptance that you offered them. You understood their patterns in ways most people don't. You had patience for their defensive behavior that most people won't have. You saw their wounds with compassion rather than with judgment. This understanding and acceptance was rare and valuable, providing them with experience of being seen and still cared about that they're unlikely to find easily with others. When they could access you, even just through occasional contact or through knowing they could reach out, they had access to this understanding and acceptance. But your unavailability means they've lost access to one of the few people who truly understood them and accepted them despite their patterns, and they're discovering that this understanding and acceptance is not something most people offer. The avoidant person lost the role you played in their life, whether that was as romantic partner, as companion, as confidant, as person they could share certain parts of themselves with. Even if they were distant, or if the relationship had ended, you likely still fulfilled certain functions in their psychological and emotional life. You were person they thought about, person who understood certain aspects of their experience, person they could imagine sharing things with, even if they weren't actually doing so. Your unavailability means these functions are no longer being fulfilled, creating void in their life that they're noticing through its absence. They've lost the specific niche you occupied, and they're finding that other people don't fit into that niche in the same way. The avoidant person lost their ability to alleviate their guilt through apologizing or explaining or offering partial amends. When people have access to someone they've hurt, they can attempt to manage their guilt through expressions of regret, through explanations that help them feel understood, through small gestures that ease their conscience without requiring full accountability or change. But your unavailability removes this option. They cannot reach you to apologize. They cannot explain themselves in ways that might ease their guilt. They cannot offer the small gestures of connection or regret that might make them feel better about their behavior. They're stuck with their guilt and their regret without any way to alleviate these uncomfortable feelings. and this psychological discomfort is more intense than it would be if they could at least attempt to make amends or explain themselves. The avoidant person lost their ability to control the narrative and the ending, to have the last word, or to shape how things concluded. By revoking access before they could have final conversations or reach whatever conclusion they preferred, you took away their ability to control how the relationship story ends in their mind and in yours. They cannot craft the ending they want. They cannot ensure you understand their perspective. They cannot get closure on their terms. The ending is now defined by your decision to revoke access rather than by any mutual conclusion or by their preferred framing. This loss of control over the narrative and the ending is particularly difficult for someone who needs control to feel safe. The avoidant person lost the specific future possibilities that maintaining access would have allowed. Even if they weren't actively pursuing relationship with you, having access meant the future remained open, undefined, full of possibilities that could be explored when they felt ready. They could imagine reconnecting someday, could fantasize about timing working out differently in the future, could maintain the possibility of something developing if circumstances changed. But your unavailability closed off these future possibilities. There's no longer undefined future where something might happen between you. The future is defined by your absence, by the unavailability you've created. This closing of future possibilities is a form of loss that is particularly painful because it's about losing not just what was, but what could have been. The avoidant person lost you as standard or comparison point against which they measured other connections. Your presence in their life, even if just in their awareness or through occasional contact, functioned as reference point. They compared other people to you, measured other connections against what they had with you, used their relationship with you as way of understanding what they wanted or what was possible. Your unavailability removes this reference point, leaving them without the measuring stick they were using to evaluate other connections. They're discovering that without you to compare to, they're unsure what they're looking for or whether other connections measure up to something they can no longer access. Why maintaining this boundary is the most powerful thing you can do. The power of revoking the avoidant person's access to you is not just in the initial act, but in maintaining that boundary over time, in refusing to soften it or to make exceptions, in consistently choosing your well-being over their comfort or their requests for reconnection. Understanding why maintaining this boundary is crucial reveals both why it's powerful and why it's essential for your continued healing and forward movement. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it demonstrates to yourself and to them that your boundaries are real and non-negotiable, rather than being flexible or subject to negotiation when they decide they want access. If you revoked access, but then granted it again when they reached out, or if you maintained the boundary inconsistently, you would teach them that your boundaries are negotiable, that persistent efforts can break through them, that your decisions can be changed if they apply the right pressure or say the right things. But maintaining the boundary firmly over time teaches the opposite lesson, that your boundaries are real, that your decisions stand, that you mean what you say, and you follow through on what you decide. This consistency in boundary maintenance is powerful because it builds your own trust in yourself and your ability to protect yourself, and it prevents them from believing they can manipulate or negotiate their way back into access. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it protects you from being pulled back into the dynamics that hurt you. The avoidant person's patterns don't change simply because they lost access to you. If you allowed them back in, whether fully or partially, you would likely experience the same patterns that drove you to revoke access in the first place. The hot and cold behavior, the inconsistency, the emotional unavailability, the push-pull dynamic. Maintaining the boundary protects you from re-experiencing these painful patterns, from having your healing disrupted by their reappearance, from being pulled back into the anxiety and uncertainty that characterize your connection with them. The longer you maintain the boundary, the more your nervous system settles, the more your self-worth rebuilds, the more your life reorganizes around your own well-being, rather than around managing their patterns. Breaking the boundary would disrupt all of this healing. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it allows you to move forward fully, rather than remaining stuck in ambiguous middle ground, hoping for change that rarely comes. If you maintained partial contact, or if you kept the door open for potential future reconnection, you would likely remain emotionally invested in them and in the possibility of the relationship working out somehow. This ongoing investment would prevent you from fully grieving the loss, from fully opening yourself to new possibilities, from fully building the life and possibly the new relationship that you deserve. Maintaining firm boundary allows you to close this chapter completely, to grieve what was and what could have been, and to genuinely move forward with your full energy and attention directed toward your present and your future, rather than toward your past with them. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it's the only thing that might create sufficient discomfort for the avoidant person to actually do the work to change their patterns. Most avoidants never address their attachment wounds or change their patterns because their patterns don't create sufficient consequences to motivate the difficult work required. They can lose relationships and still find new people to engage with. They can hurt people and still maintain enough connections to avoid true loneliness. But your firm boundary, maintained over time, creates real consequence that they cannot avoid or mitigate. This consequence might be the only thing that would ever motivate them to seek therapy, to examine their patterns, to do the uncomfortable work of addressing their attachment wounds. There's no guarantee they will do this work, even with the consequence, but maintaining the boundary at least creates the possibility, whereas allowing access despite their patterns ensures they never have sufficient motivation to change. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it honors your own growth and the lessons you've learned through the painful experience of being in relationship with someone avoidant. You learned that you deserve consistency, emotional presence, reciprocity, someone who can show up for you without requiring you to manage their anxiety about intimacy. You learned that you won't sacrifice your well-being for a relationship that doesn't serve you. You learned that you can walk away from what doesn't work, even when you care deeply. Maintaining the boundary honors these lessons and the growth they represent. Breaking the boundary would dishonor your growth and would communicate to yourself that the lessons don't matter, that you'll repeat the same patterns despite what you learned. The boundary is a statement of your values and your standards and your commitment to living according to what you now know you need and deserve. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it prevents you from becoming source of validation or ego boost for them without requiring them to actually show up in healthy ways. If you allowed access, even just through friendship or occasional contact, you would likely be providing them with validation, with understanding, with acceptance, with companionship, all without them having to do the work of being in genuine reciprocal relationship with you. They would get benefits of your presence without the responsibility of meeting your needs or addressing their patterns. Maintaining the boundary ensures that if they want access to you and to what you provide, they must demonstrate genuine change, sustained effort, and capacity to show up as true partner rather than as defended person who wants the benefits of relationship without the vulnerability it requires. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it protects your nervous system and your emotional stability from the dysregulation that contact with them would likely create. Your nervous system has been learning to regulate in their absence, to find stability and peace without the constant activation that their inconsistency created. Even small contact would likely reactivate your attachment system, would create hope or anxiety or confusion, would disrupt the regulation you've been building. Maintaining firm boundary allows your nervous system to continue healing, to learn that you're safe without them, to build capacity for regulation that isn't dependent on managing their behavior or their patterns. Maintaining the boundary is powerful because it communicates to the universe and to yourself what you will and won't accept, setting energetic foundation for what you call into your life next. When you maintain firm boundaries against treatment that doesn't serve you, you communicate that you value yourself, that you have standards, that you require reciprocity and consistency and genuine care. This communication isn't just to the avoidant person, it's to yourself, and it's an energetic statement about what you're available for. This makes you less likely to accept similar treatment from others in the future and more likely to attract or recognize people who can actually meet your needs, because you've demonstrated through your boundary with the avoidant person that you won't settle for less than you deserve. The most powerful aspect of maintaining this boundary is that it's an act of radical self-love and self-protection that prioritizes your well-being over their comfort, over the possibility of reconciliation, over the hope that things might be different. It's choosing yourself, your healing, your growth, your future over the familiar pull of what was or what could have been. It's trusting that you deserve better than what they could offer, and that better exists somewhere else with someone who has the capacity they lack. It's accepting that loving someone and being loved by someone is not sufficient for relationship to work if one person cannot show up consistently and vulnerably and with genuine commitment to the partnership. The boundary says, I loved you, you loved me, and that wasn't enough, because love requires capacity and action and consistency that you could not provide. And rather than waiting for you to develop that capacity or accepting the limited version of relationship you could offer, I'm choosing to move forward into the full life and the full love that I deserve. That choice, maintained firmly over time, despite any discomfort or any attempts to breach it, is the most powerful move you could make for yourself and the most important boundary you will likely ever set.